Hi, welcome back. Going to take another look around the graph, which represents journeys over to the east, over to the west, back in time, up to the contemporary time. As you can see, we're out behind the graph at the moment, so it's a kind of backwards globe, backwards map there. So I'm going to fly past it and go turn around. Yeah, so we've been doing some journeys which we can say span from the ancient wisdom and philosophies up into the Enlightenment and the revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, French Revolution, and then with modernity and science emerging, and then the cultural exchange and the synthesis as the world starts to come together and starts to share ideas and compare ideas in new ways. The contemporary challenges and opportunities that this presents including my advocacy, which is for mindfulness, Buddhism, and the triple gem, as it's called, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, to be incorporated into Western culture, thereby bringing a lot of relief from avoidable suffering. And we're beginning to see this, for example, in places like Australia and America and England, many places in Europe, where successful routing, settling, networking has been happening for a good 130 years or so, step by step, and increasing over the last 30 years. So yeah, let's look, beginning with the ancient wisdom and philosophies of the East. This takes many different shapes. Many of the people like Jung have taken an interest in the teachings of the Buddha, but from their own particular point of view. Often they've come looking to reconfirm a theory, I think. I've taken quite a big interest in Carl Jung over the years. Obviously, I think most people are aware who are in this scope that people like Jordan Peterson have rekindled some enthusiasm into his ideas and teachings. He had a good look at Tibetan Buddhism, and I think, as I say, he was starting off with a viewpoint and then seeing in the Tibetan teachings what he could find that matched up with it and reconfirmed, rather than seeing it as it is. Very interesting person. I think when you read his works and then you see film footage of him talking and being interviewed, it's quite different, I find. The person who comes across in his written works, like the Red Book, which I had loaned to me, huge tome, massive book with very beautiful printed pages. Shamdasani person edited and was responsible for that. Those show a person of great imagination, artistry, and depth and insight, who is very interested in medieval works. So that's Jung is just one of the people who took a great interest in Buddhism, quite an interest, I wouldn't say a great interest, along with African and Aboriginal and Mexican and Egyptian cultures. He wasn't committed into looking as far as all that, or particularly going on sort of retreats and so on. How much his ideas and theories concur and are confluent is another matter as well. And that also spans psychiatry. He started off much in there, and that's always it's a little bit difficult to say how Buddhism relates with psychiatry. That's not an easy one to answer. Let's have a look at Western psychiatry. I enjoy learning about the history of mental health, and how a lot of the systems and ideas that have become mainstream now, the background behind them, some of it highly unpleasant to look into. But we're already in the right zone if we're looking at Freud here, 1921, the Rorschach test, Sigmund Freud publishing his first introduction to psychoanalysis, works on narcissism. Citing Freud's inability to acknowledge religion and spirituality, Carl Jung split and developed his own teaching. So there we have also the schools of the analytic schools, all of them interested in some level or many of the levels of this idea of the unconscious, not all of them altogether. Alfred Adler formed his own, accusing Freud of basing his ideas just on his own background and upbringing and his own conditioning. And there's a very interesting book called A Dream of a Science, which was where Jung started to try to create the ground of a new discipline, psychology, which hadn't really been there. We take for granted some of the separations of the disciplines, but the way that philosophy and religion, anthropology, sociology, the way that these separated out happened over time, gradually, but he was trying to create that ground based on his belief system on it. And also the students of him, people like Erich Neumann, went on to try to take those ideas even further, but because they mix in ideas of mysticism and things like Egyptian mythology, it starts not being able to compete on the same grounds that some of the other things like the cognitive behavioral psychotherapies and counselings could, because they could be entered into mainstream in schools, and in cooperating with the police to try to understand psychopathology, which you can't really do that with some of those more mystical, ideas involving alchemy and also even the childhood stages of development, which were emphasized by Freud and Erich Neumann, for example. So now we're back in the 13th century, 12th century, and looking into the Middle East, where notice what's happening in the West is a lot of emphasis on the brain, the nervous system, that the Buddha didn't feel the need to do that, even though he did associate with one of his key disciples. Visakha was a surgeon and was a fully qualified, highly skilled medical doctor. There's even a description of him performing a trapedectomy, like a brain penetrating into the brain to do some surgery. It's quite interesting. I think it's one of the earliest accounts, or it's a very early account. I won't make that claim like that because I know also in Egypt they were doing brain surgery quite early on. Interesting. So yeah, Carl Jung, one of the analytical school. Analytic philosophy around that era and around those times, interest in the unconscious and the subconscious. And so again, we see some parallels with meditation and insight, but often the premise of it, the bases of it, are heading in a whole different direction, or starting from a different viewpoint. So let's have a look at the analytical school. We had also people like Bertrand Russell, who are starting to want to involve other disciplines. They're involving mathematics. Again, the Buddha, I've never heard the Buddha refer to mathematics, actually, unlike people like Aristotle. Schools that were following that, his line of discipline, often say you cannot enter here unless you've understood, how to calculate the radius of an arc. And Pythagorean, for example, Pythagoras was mixing and combining mathematics with astrology and music. So people like Bertrand Russell starting to take a mathematical approach. We'd already seen in the previous video, Wilhelm Wundt was trying to use laboratory approaches and discipline to approach the mind. As people like Carl Jung had tried that approach when he was working at the Berkeley, for example. That's depicted in the movie The Dangerous Method, where you see meticulous noting of free association and recording with a quill pen, in a ledger, noting every single kind of reaction and response. That is the approach that Wundt was trying to use. So it's a very much more clinical and using meticulous recording and a scientific approach. So the analytical school, I mentioned Bertrand Russell, for example. So that he's starting to use a very much more formulaic approach and mathematics and numbers to approach the ideas of the mind and philosophy, which is very different. You get people of his time, such as Isaiah Berlin, and they are very much more poetic, a lot more random, and a lot more just simply about people, and anecdotal, and quite humorous, and full of bluster and bombast. In a way, his talks are quite extraordinary, like a aerial bombardment of thousands of these ideas in rapid succession or strung together. Quite interesting to hear. So then we have functionalism. That also came from Wilhelm Wundt and Tickner as well, his student. Okay, let's let go of that. So we're in this era when we're looking at the analytic school of the early 20th century. So if we work sort of backwards, we get people such as we had Freud, but Mesmer was an interesting case of mixing up sort of metaphysics in a way that the Buddha didn't. And he had all kinds of ideas to do with magnetism, I've seen people in this time and era in various parts of the world where they're using the same sort of logic. Mesmer believed in the field of a liquid plasma sort of healing magnetism that enveloped the body, particularly his body. He had lots of it. So he would get people to sit in rooms where there were glass chimes being played, a sort of spinet of cylindrical chimes that were rotated through water to get them wet, and then the fingers would be played up and along these spinning bowls, which would create a sort of very haunting, high-pitched drone, sort of ghostly sort of sound. And then people would sit in chairs around a kind of metal fountain, which had these large metal prongs that came out that people would touch, and he could create a sort of circuit. He would close the circuit himself, holding two metal or two hands together, and through this sort of idea of this magnetic life force, send out or connect this sort of healing energy. Well, there's a lot of suggestion in there, and like as I saw in the late 20th century, I saw people still buying into this sort of pseudo-scientific idea. He was later discounted and denounced as a charlatan. I think Benjamin Franklin was one of the people who investigated his theories. To what extent he was purely naive and well-intentioned, or to what extent he was a fraud, deliberate fraud, that's another question. His method was a transition in a way. Prior to him, people who were working in the similar sort of area, which is direct healing of people who are in some sort of distress, or they have some sort of ailment that is in need of attention of some kind. Previous to him, there was a lot of alchemy and a lot of exorcism, a lot of driving out of demons and devils, and so on. With Mesmer, he was trying to use a form of semi-scientific thinking to sort of bridge the gap where knowledge was lacking. After him, the ideas of hypnotherapy and suggestion that came out of the mesmerism were taken up by people like Bleuler, who was working at the same place as Sigmund Freud, and Bleuler encouraged Freud to look into this as a method, and he did so with mixed results. Bleuler, this is it. He termed this schizophrenia. So unlike other people, such as Abraham Maslow, for example, didn't believe in looking at people who were suffering from mental health issues in order to learn about the mind. He disagreed with Freud, all the Freuds, Anna Freud, Jung, who were mainly at first all looking into psychiatric sort of cases. And he believed, he was in America, he believed in looking at super fit and healthy people who were having peak moment experiences. So psychiatry, to what extent the presence of psychiatry around some of our great thinkers about the mind, that creates a certain tension. There isn't any emphasis in the Buddha, for working with people who have sort of mental health issues. There's an interesting distinction. In fact, there's a bit of more of an encouragement in his advice to monks in training is to avoid people who are imbalanced. It's not the imbalanced isn't the term they quite use. It's more like fools. But the meaning, people who are aggressive, people who have a lot of habits and craving like gambling, alcohol, and violence, is avoid them. Associate with people who are healthy and calm. Yeah. So back to Bleuler was one of those people. So interesting to look at how all of these correlate, and again how to make comparisons, which views are in play, and how this sets the scene for this transition, which is the 20th century. The 19th century, the 18th century, how the Enlightenment thinkers and the revolutions that were there. For example, there are the German Romantics, which I've been taking an interest in after reading a book on Buddhist Romanticism. I found that quite an interesting subject. I wasn't previously that aware of it, and I'm still very much sort of finding my way through all of these topics, because when you train in Buddhism, you don't really get much encouragement to look at things that happened after the Buddha. So it kind of goes without saying, because the Buddha wasn't talking about Germany, and the Buddha wasn't talking about people in the 20th century. So they're kind of not on the menu. So I was fortunate to have a teacher in Bhante Punyaji who had spent 40 years in America and Canada, and therefore he had also developed a strong basis of understanding about Western culture. He would talk about the empiricists, the British empiricists, John Locke, David Hume, and he would talk about Rousseau, and he would make the distinction about them and how it relates to Buddhism and how it doesn't relate to Buddhism in many cases. So let's have a look at the neighbouring ones is what I want to have a look at. If it will load. It's being a bit slow. So a number of the people who were the German Romantics, might be able to read it through this one. Friedrich, which is a spelling mistake, Friedrich Schiller, 1759 to 1805. The German Romantics were around the time 1796 through to about 1803. So Friedrich Schiller, he's a dramatist, a poet, a writer. He was earlier than them. The Romantics themselves were not that old. They were quite young. So he would have been in his 90s, or he'd been very old. No, he would have been about 50, something like that. But the other ones, Friedrich Schelling, Friedrich Schleiermacher, George Hardenberg, or Novalis as he's known, Friedrich Hölderlin, August Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel, Johann Fichte, these earlier. Many of these other ones would die in kind of 50 years after that, 40 years after that. They were much younger at the time. They were a small collective who, they were quite new age in their outlooks, and they were creating more of a manifesto of a new spiritual way of looking at the universe, which was permitted. It had become kind of allowable and potentially there through the absence of the power of the religion. I'm just trying to put... Schiller, sorry. There had been the 30 Years' War, great brutality. 30 years, an enormous amount of people can die throughout that time. So the credibility over very petty issues to do with whether the transubstantiation is a real thing or not. Yes, that Schiller, can't quite see it tiny. Yeah, Schiller Misk. So some information about Schiller. I'd like to get... So he would have been setting the scene. He would have been earlier on arguing for and exploring for freedoms and ideas, exploring them. So championing the idea of the beautiful soul as a moral ideal. The German poet, philosopher, physician, and playwright. Constantly having financial difficulties. He was a close friend of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, also a great playwright. So that was in a way seen as the pinnacle of human life and achievement for them, which was to create these, like Faustus, incredible dramatic pieces of work. Also worked as a surgeon. And he explored the relationship between art, morality, and freedom. So that's why he's important. And they do that through their craft, through their work. And that also affects their philosophy. So it's the same, in the same way that the Greeks were exploring simultaneously perspective, ideas of perspective, the infinity of things like perspective and distance and space, and then mixing that, combining that together with metaphysics. So, critique the social and political injustices of his time. So already we're starting to get that sort of rights, that very much a Western tone of spirituality. He's considered to be, in a way, the second foremost playwright in Germany. Goethe is largely acknowledged as the greatest. William Tell and Don Carlos, regarded as one of the greatest German literary figures of his time. Sorry, I didn't quite qualify that. What else? I can't quite. This a little bit too far away. So that's easier to read. Then they get a bit faster. So I can't quite win here. Yes, I looked up whether or not he was a Freemason. It's a curiosity about the German Romantics that when you look up on a standard catalogue of Freemasons, who is and who isn't a Freemason, 95%+ of them are Freemasons. I only found one who wasn't. Notice many of them are called Friedrich. Frederick the Great of Germany was he was a monarch to underwrite the Freemasonry, to give it his blessing. So in Thailand and in India, you had monarchs who endorsed and underwrote and gave the protectorate seal for, say, Buddhism. Well, what happened in Germany was you've got the Frederick the Great, the Frederick II, doing the same thing for Freemasonry. And Freemasonry has a religion basically of its own. It's a monotheistic, well, it's semi-pantheistic, semi-monistic. What they tried to do was to fuse together gods. They took the god from the Egyptian myths of the god Osiris, which was a father figure in a family, become God, become one with Ra. That was fused together with the god Baal, the great pagan Baal, god of the underworld, and then fused together with Yahweh, the Judaic god. So there's sort of three major religious powers. And also there's elements of the Brahmin gods and beliefs as well. So, but they're all monotheistic, and then they're all fused together. So it's like a sort of ménage à trois of religions all into one new god. Almost, so there's a new god, which is called Jah Balon, mixing those names on. The Jah from Yahweh, Baal, On. On is the part of Osiris, Jah Balon. So, and they were paying homage in secret with a lot of rules and regulations and hierarchy to this god, Jah Balon, which was this new god who was the alleged architect of the universe. So into a world where physics and science is creating a sort of meaningless, empty universe that is just clockwork and moving through just the laws of physics. There's no anthropomorphic father up there with his beard lovingly planning and punishing and so on, like with as in with theology and theism. They introduced this new system of thinking where you work through levels of craftsmanship and apprenticeship and learn this philosophical craft. So it has elements in there of similar to alchemy. And people like Carl Jung, his grandfather was the highest level Freemason of Switzerland. So it's not as if this is not an aspect which wasn't going to be affecting. So back to Schiller. Great correspondent. There's amazing lives of creativity. It was inspired by the works of Goethe, Kant, and Rousseau as well. Let's have a look at Rousseau in a minute. Yeah, recurring illness and depression through his life. So hard lives. Explored themes of idealism, heroism, and sacrifice. So we see those themes coming up and around and again. Drew inspiration from ancient Greek tragedy and mythology. Emphasized transformative power of art and literature. This is very important with all of the German romantics, like Hölderlin and Fichte, who spoke about. They believe that by writing novels and novellas, by painting, by drawing, by writing particularly dramatic literature, writing, fictional, you can transform your life. It's like writing the script to your own life as part of it. And in order to do that, you have to sort of expand your imagination out to see the enormity of opportunity. Let's have a look at Rousseau. He went past to do with Kant. There he goes, yeah. Also an enormously influential person from this time. So we're going to release from Schiller, very influential person. And let's go look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau. With these spheres, you kind of need to go in at just the right angle and place, and then you can get a sort of nice Fichte, is it? Schelling, Schiller, and Fichte. Very interesting people. Engels. Those are German romantics. So Rousseau is a humanist, a romantic, in a time when you had other people who were putting forward ideas like the Leviathan idea of Hobbes, where they were basically saying humanity are grunts. They need bullies to pound them into submission. You need a strong authority, otherwise tragedy and will happen. So that's this bleak idea of Hobbes. But people like Rousseau were turning around, contrary to that, and saying, no, that's not what people need. They need freedom, and they need love, and they need encouragement and support. They don't need to be battered down and herded like cattle and confined to stop them kind of, explosively rebelling. No, they don't need that. He was particularly very influential in the areas of, the French Revolution, but also education and the perception of children, which is that they are beautiful, that they are full of potential, and they respond to care, and they respond to sensitive, concerned, warm attitudes, not being punished with a stick the whole time for existing. So that idea also, the idea that people are born out of sin, that they are born out of that kind of existing is a kind of crime and it's a kind of punishment. That was coming out of some of the ideas of the religion of the time. The Catholic Church were teaching that the birth from original sin created this perception. So then we have Rousseau coming forward and responding. So these are the Enlightenment thinkers, the humanists, and the sensitive thinkers. And so you get a very polar opposite. You get the sort of militaristic, Napoleonic, empiric vision of the way people should be and society should be. You get the sort of monarchs like Louis XIV and the Versailles, the bewigged aristocracy, and then the lowly masses, and then you get the romantics, and you get the church. Obviously, they've got their version of how things should be. And then you got these romantics coming up, and they were also critically in the area of geographically where there was the biggest concentration of factory development. So steel production, the foundries, the new cities, and then this crisis of humanity comes up. It's similar, for example, with Tolkien, who was near Birmingham, which was the centre of the arms manufacturing. And if you compare Birmingham of that time with the sort of enormous slums and difficulty, the sort of working class life, compared with the Cotswolds and Herefordshire. That's very much Hobbit world, and then you see these sort of dark satanic mills and all that. So the Romantics, Wordsworth, Coleridge, in England were also responding, but the German Romantics did it differently. They did it more with a psychological and spiritual yogic vision outwardly. So it wasn't only poetry, but it was also looking and discussing about astronomy and the infinite nature of the universe, and forming theories such as, and working up other theories that were already around. So like Herder had his theory of vitalism, which followed on from, I think it was Baruch Spinoza, but one of them who said that the universe is infinite, unlike we've been told. It does go on and on and on, like trillions upon billions upon gazillions of grains of sand off into space, and each grain of sand is a solar system, yes, but it is all God. It is inanimate, but the sheer infinity of it is God. So it's a kind of spin on it. But he would get heavily, like Spinoza, he would get thoroughly alienated for saying such things. It's still not that far away from the Spanish Inquisition and the power of the church. And generally speaking, there was a lot of fear of atheism, while there was this fascination of what could happen with science. So people like Herder came along and said, he's nearly right. No, they were also acknowledging the sheer scope. I mean, they couldn't deny it by then. Copernicus had already shown the size of the infinite universe and other galaxies and solar systems. So the whole man-centric and solar-centric, heliocentric ideas had been dismissed, and the world was starting to learn how enormous the universe and the galaxies are, the Milky Way is, and so on. But he was saying that Herder was saying with vitalism, there is an invisible force that moves through it. Oh, it's not just inanimate. They call it that an organic universe. So it's a universe that is listening, that has intelligence, and it has teleos. It has a purpose about it. And this is what the German Romantics wanted to harness, versus this sense of nihilism when you look around at an industrial, modern, godless society, or sort of Nietzsche. Nietzsche had this view, and then you have this bleak, meaningless. You have this sort of Durkheim studies of suicide. It gets sort of darker and darker, and so you get the Romantics, which have a great belief in the restorative power of arts, literature, drama, novel writing, music and painting and the arts, and a very sort of blissful vision of nature. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very interesting. But many of the ideas, because they come from a place of deep passion, often they also foment nationalism, and this is one of the big problems of all of the German Romantics is that many of those ideas went on to be used later in the mid-20th century, as we well know. now in retrospect, because they turned into the ideas of the Nazis and those ideals, which is often the case. But so yeah, romantic idealism can easily get turned into that sort of passionate national ideal, and then the idea of the father figure, the fatherland. You know, often you hear this with Russian and German, and well, any place where you have heavy nationalism. Then that often leads to what we see here with the alt-right. You get similar blood and soil, cultural racism, transphobia, anti-Semitism. So often they're drinking from a similar well. And it comes from this deep, often national identity, soul. So when people start looking for that, Carl Jung was one who ventured down this road, and that's been controversial. Often it goes that way. It's, again, with Buddhism, you don't find that. There isn't really much scope for ego of a nationalist kind, or the usage of his ideas. Someone who's primarily teaching there is no eternal soul or self. It's very difficult to turn that into racism, or you are not your body. The body identification is a falsity, and teaching obviously harmless peacefulness. So it's one of the reasons it doesn't. Another part of the wisdom where it can't get misused. Even people like Nietzsche hated what happened and what was going to happen to his teaching via his sister, for example, who passed his ideas over to Nazis, who then used it. But he had already seen and predicted that the rise of the German nationalism in a very dangerous way, that the possibility was there, and that his ideas could possibly be used like that. The idea of the Übermensch and the Superman sort of ideal. Okay, so let's go back to Buddhism. How is this done though? So we've seen some of the pitfalls of views. Sati Patthana is one of the big keys to obtaining insights. So this is just this sort of very ad hoc group of Sati Patthana concepts sort of bundled together in any particular order. But quite nice, enjoyable to reflect and observe it. This is one of the keys. We often ask, well, how did the Buddha manage to avoid some of the pitfalls that other religions and philosophies and ways of life have fallen into? Sati Patthana is a big part of that. So focusing on the body and its impermanent nature, how you can't control it. Focusing on the feelings, focusing on the perceptions, focusing on the mind states with mindful awareness. And that's one of the main practices and the main keys. Enormous sense of maturity and benefit that's been brought by the Buddha to humanity with this central teaching. The simplicity of it as well. Mindfulness, this inner act of observing, taking stock, evaluating, observing in a discriminating way, combination of non-judgmental and discriminating, to be able to see and know what is toxic and what is harmless, and to be able to weed out what needs to be changed so that we direct our mind and our life accordingly. Okay, that's. I think we'll leave it at that for now. A little sort of meditative float through so if I just click this, I think that releases us off into spinning out into space. There you go. All right. Take care, and I hope you enjoyed our little journey, and look forward to you joining us again to explore space with ideas and a little journey through the spiritual domain.